Aboard cargo ship Tatsutamaru, on February 8, 1943, Executive Officer Yoshio Nakamura wrote his final diary entry, "Radar contact, American submarine." This entry was recovered decades later when his diary washed ashore at Yokohama. USS Tarpon had fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 hit. Tatsutamaru sank in 90 seconds, so fast that 943 passengers and crew had no time to reach lifeboats. The former luxury liner, pride of the Nippon Yusen Kaisha line that had carried tourists between San Francisco and Tokyo for 12 years, simply vanished. Nakamura's watch stopped at 3:47. The sinking of Tatsutamaru marked a turning point in Japanese merchant marine psychology. Officers who had sailed fearlessly now requested transfers to shore duty. Crews began demanding double pay for voyages through the Luzon Strait, called by Japanese sailors Torpedo Alley. The Japanese merchant fleet, which required 6 million tons of operational shipping to sustain the empire's war economy and supply lines, was bleeding ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Warrant Officer Kazuo Sakamoto, a convoy escort commander aboard destroyer Hamikase, filed a report in April 1943 that was classified by Japanese naval intelligence but later captured by American forces. American submarines operate with intelligence that suggests they know our routes in advance. They wait at choke points, attack at night on the surface using radar we cannot detect, and withdraw before our escorts can respond. Our depth charges cannot reach them when they dive deep. Our sonar cannot track them through thermal layers. We are fighting an enemy we cannot see and cannot hurt. The Americans had indeed cracked Japanese naval codes. Operation Magic provided submarine commanders with the routes, schedules, and sometimes even the cargo manifests of Japanese convoys. Combined with ultra-intelligence from breaking the Japanese merchant shipping code, American submarines knew exactly where targets would be and when they would arrive. It was not warfare. It was slaughter arranged by appointment. By mid-1943, the number of American submarines in the Pacific had grown from 55 to 104. Each submarine made approximately 5 patrols per year. Each patrol lasted approximately 60 days. With 100 submarines at sea simultaneously, Japanese merchant ships faced a cordon of steel spanning from the Japanese home islands to Singapore, from the Philippines to New Guinea. Every major shipping lane was covered. Every important harbor was watched. Convoys that sailed on schedule to predictable destinations became coffins for thousands of men. The summer of 1943 brought particular horror to Japanese merchant sailors. On July 23, transport Montevideo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Australian prisoners of war and civilians, was torpedoed by USS Sturgeon off the Philippines. The ship sank in 11 minutes. There were no survivors among the prisoners, though Japanese crew members abandoned ship successfully. The incident would become Australia's worst maritime disaster, though it remained unknown until after the war. American submarines had no way to distinguish prisoner transports from troop transports. Lieutenant Teisher Nakao, a Japanese escort officer aboard destroyer Uricase, kept a private journal that survived the war. August 1943. Lost 3 ships this week to American submarines. The convoys are becoming suicide runs. Merchant captains argue with my orders, insisting on routes that add days to voyages but avoid known submarine zones. I cannot blame them. Last month, we lost 7 transports in the Makassar Strait. The Americans are everywhere and nowhere. We see their periscopes for seconds before torpedoes strike. By the time depth charges are ready, they have vanished into the deep. Our escorts spend hours dropping charges at empty water while survivors drown because we cannot stop to rescue them. The death toll was not limited to sailors and soldiers. Japanese transports carried hundreds of thousands of forced laborers called romusha, conscripted from occupied territories. When transports sank, these laborers locked in holds drowned without any chance of escape. Additionally, Allied prisoners of war were being transported on unmarked ships called hell ships. By survivors' accounts, when American submarines torpedoed these vessels, thousands of Allied prisoners died. Estimates suggest approximately 10,800 Allied prisoners of war died in submarine attacks during the Pacific War. The Americans had no way to know prisoners were aboard. Japanese vessels were not marked according to Geneva Convention protocols. By January 1944, Japan's shipping situation had become critical. The empire required 5.9 million tons of merchant shipping to maintain both the domestic economy and military operations. Actual available tonnage had fallen to 4.1 million tons. New construction could not keep pace with losses. January saw 112,000 tons sunk. February saw 217,000 tons sunk. March saw 167,000 tons sunk. In March 1944, a document was circulated among Japanese merchant marine officers that would later be captured by American intelligence in Manila. The document, titled Analysis of Convoy Defense Failures, laid bare the catastrophic situation. American submarines attack with surface radar at night, a capability our escorts do not possess. They coordinate in wolf packs, something we believed only German U-boats could do. They have reliable torpedoes that explode on contact, unlike our Type 93, which often fails. Most critically, they receive intelligence about our convoy routes from unknown sources, allowing them to position in advance. Defensive measures have failed. Increasing escort strength does not decrease losses. Routing convoys through different areas only reveals new submarine patrol zones. The American submarine force is too large, too skilled, and too well informed for our countermeasures to succeed. Captain Yasumi Grand, Escort Force Headquarters, wrote in his diary in April 1944, "We are losing this war one transport at a time. The Army demands reinforcements for the Philippines, for New Guinea, for the Marianas. Every convoy we send loses ships. Last week, the Tichy convoy lost 4 transports to submarine attacks, killing over 4,000 soldiers. These were veteran troops from China, impossible to replace. The Americans do not need to invade if they can starve our garrisons and sink our reinforcements." The Tichy convoy disaster of April 1944 demonstrated how thoroughly American submarines dominated Pacific waters. The convoy carried the 32nd Division bound for Mindanao and the 35th Division bound for western New Guinea. On April 26, USS Jack torpedoed transport Yoshida Maru, killing 1,544 soldiers. On May 6, USS Gurnard sank transport Aden Maru, killing 350 troops. Later that day, USS Angler torpedoed Taimaru, killing 600 troops. Finally, USS Gurnard returned to sink Tenshin Maru, killing 1,500 soldiers. The surviving ships of the Tichy convoy diverted to Halmahera, where the decimated divisions were unloaded far from their intended destination. Douglas MacArthur's forces invaded Hollandia days later, bypassing the positions these divisions were meant to defend. The failure of the Tichy convoy forced Japanese Imperial headquarters to acknowledge that western New Guinea could no longer be reinforced or defended. But nothing prepared the Japanese for the night of August 18, 1944, when convoy HI-71 sailed into the waiting guns of an American submarine wolf pack. Japanese military leadership could no longer deny the catastrophic effectiveness of American submarines. In December 1944, Army General Yoshiro Umezu submitted a report to the Imperial War Council that concluded, "Submarine attacks have rendered seaborne reinforcement of our defensive positions impossible. The Philippines cannot be adequately reinforced. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies cannot supply fuel to the homeland because tankers are sunk faster than they can be replaced. Strategic raw materials from Southeast Asia accumulate in warehouses because transport ships no longer arrive. The American submarine campaign has strangled our war economy. Without imported oil, our aircraft cannot fly. Our warships cannot sail. Our industries cannot produce. We are being defeated not by superior force but by superior strategy." The statistics supported this grim assessment. Japan began the war with 6.4 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of 1944, only 2.1 million tons remained operational. New construction during the war added 3.9 million tons, but losses exceeded 8.9 million tons by war's end. American submarines accounted for approximately 55% of these losses. Carrier aircraft and mines accounted for most of the rest. By early 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was effectively destroyed. Shipping capacity fell below the 2 million tons required to feed the Japanese population. Starvation became a real possibility for Japanese civilians. By summer 1945, the human cost was equally staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that American submarines killed at least 97,342 Japanese soldiers in transport sinkings during the Pacific War. This exceeds American combat deaths inflicted by the Marine Corps and Army combined during the entire Central Pacific drive from Tarawa in November 1943 to Iwo Jima in March 1945. Additional tens of thousands of merchant sailors, civilian workers, and forced laborers died in the same attacks. The true total may exceed 150,000 deaths directly attributable to submarine warfare. For Japanese sailors and soldiers ordered to board transports, the voyage became a death sentence. Survivors of submarine attacks reported nightmares for years afterward, the sound of torpedoes striking hull plates, the screaming of trapped men as compartments flooded, the darkness and confusion as ships capsized, the hours spent floating in oil-slicked water hoping for rescue that often never came. These memories haunted those who survived. Ensign Haruki Itoto, who survived the sinking of Maya-san Maru by clinging to debris for 18 hours before being rescued, described the experience in a 1978 interview. The torpedo hit sounded like a massive hammer striking an iron plate. The ship lurched violently. Men fell down ladders, crushing those below. Water rushed into the hold. The emergency lighting failed immediately. In complete darkness, thousands of men tried to reach the deck. Most could not find the ladders. Those who did found them clogged with panicking soldiers. The ship rolled and began sinking. I was on deck when the torpedo struck, which saved my life. I jumped into the water and swam away from the ship. She sank in approximately 2 minutes. The suction pulled men underwater. I heard them screaming, then silence. I floated in the water for 18 hours before a patrol boat found me. Of the 4,500 men aboard, fewer than 700 survived. Every time I close my eyes, I see the ship sinking and hear the screaming. It never stops. By early 1945, American submarines faced an unexpected problem. They could not find enough targets. The Japanese merchant fleet had been so thoroughly decimated that submarines returned from patrols having never fired their torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb began attacking trains and factories along the Japanese coast with his deck gun because there were no ships left to sink. Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Parche requested reassignment because submarine warfare had become obsolete due to lack of targets. The strategic impact of the submarine campaign exceeded every pre-war projection. Japan's war economy collapsed not because factories were destroyed, but because raw materials could not reach the factories. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies were sunk before reaching Japan. Rubber, tin, and other strategic materials accumulated in Southeast Asian ports but could not be transported. Food supplies from Korea and Manchuria, desperately needed to feed Japanese civilians, could not be delivered safely. By March 1945, Japan's oil stockpiles were essentially depleted. The combined fleet could not sortie for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Training flights were cancelled because fuel could not be spared. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced to a handful of operational warships, remained in port as floating batteries, unable to leave harbor. In April 1945, submarine USS Tigrone under Lieutenant Commander George Street conducted what would be one of the last major submarine actions of the war, sinking 4 vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. But by then, meaningful Japanese merchant shipping had ceased to exist. The war against commerce was over. The submarines had won completely. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the merchant marine that remained consisted of 1.5 million tons of mostly damaged or barely operational vessels. Of the original 6.4 million tons that existed in December 1941, plus 3.9 million tons built during the war, 8.8 million tons had been sunk or destroyed. The Japanese merchant fleet had been annihilated more thoroughly than any merchant fleet in history. American submarine losses during this campaign totaled 52 submarines sunk in combat with 3,556 American submariners killed. This represented a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any American armed service during World War II. But the exchange ratio was devastating to Japan. For every American submarine lost, Japanese shipping losses totaled approximately 170,000 tons and thousands of personnel. No military campaign in history achieved such strategic results with such a small force. 288 American submarines, representing less than 2% of the United States Navy's tonnage, strangled an empire. The effectiveness of American submarines derived from multiple factors that compounded into overwhelming superiority. First, technological advantage. American submarines carried surface search radar, aircraft warning radar, and sonar superior to Japanese equipment. And by late 1944, even sonar capable of detecting mines. American torpedoes, once their problems were corrected, were reliable and deadly. The Mark 14 torpedo could reach ranges of 4,500 meters and ran at 46 knots. The Mark 18 electric torpedo ran quietly, leaving no wake that could betray the submarine's position. Second, intelligence superiority. Operation Magic and Ultra Code Breaking provided advanced warning of convoy routes, schedules, and composition. American submarines knew where targets would be days before they arrived. They positioned themselves in optimal attack locations and waited. Japanese convoy commanders sailed according to schedules that American submarines had already read. Third, tactical innovation. American submarines adopted Wolfpack tactics in 1943, coordinating multiple submarines against single convoys. While German U-boats pioneered this tactic, American submarines perfected it in the vast Pacific. Coordinated attacks overwhelmed Japanese escorts and ensured convoy destruction even if individual submarines were driven off. Fourth, operational doctrine. The United States Navy quickly abandoned peacetime restrictions on submarine warfare after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized unrestricted submarine warfare within hours of the attack. No warnings were given to merchant ships. Every Japanese vessel was considered a military target. This ruthless approach, while controversial, was devastatingly effective. Fifth, industrial capacity. American shipyards produced 228 submarines during World War II, replacing losses and expanding the force continuously. By contrast, Japan built fewer than 176 submarines during the same period and used them primarily against warships rather than merchant vessels. Japanese submarines, despite excellent torpedoes and advanced technology, sank only approximately 1 million tons of Allied merchant shipping during the entire war. American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping in the same period. Finally, crew quality. American submariners were volunteers, extensively trained, and highly motivated. Rest and recuperation policies between patrols prevented combat exhaustion. Submarine duty offered better pay and better living conditions than surface ships. Competition for submarine assignments was intense. By contrast, Japanese merchant marine crews by 1944 included impressed sailors, poorly trained recruits, and officers who requested transfer to any position other than convoy duty. The cumulative effect of these advantages created a system of destruction that Japan could not counter. Japanese officers understood the problem intellectually. Captain Atsushi Oi of the Imperial Japanese Navy wrote a post-war analysis titled Why Japan's Anti-Submarine Warfare Failed that identified every major deficiency. But understanding the problem and solving it were different matters. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to build the hundreds of escorts needed. Japan lacked the technological base to develop radar and sonar equivalent to American systems. Japan lacked the cultural flexibility to shift from offensive fleet warfare doctrine to defensive convoy protection. Most critically, Japan lacked time. By the time Japanese naval leadership recognized the catastrophic nature of submarine warfare, the merchant fleet was already destroyed. For the Japanese merchant mariners who survived the war, the memory of American submarines remained vivid decades later. In a 1987 reunion of Japanese merchant marine veterans in Tokyo, survivor testimonies revealed the psychological scars that never healed. Former Captain T-Shir Yamada, who survived 3 separate submarine attacks, described his nightmares. *I am 82 years old. The war ended 42 years ago. But every night, I dream of the submarines. I am on the bridge of my ship, watching the water. I see the periscope break the surface. I hear the sound of torpedoes launching. I try to turn the ship, but I move in slow motion. The torpedoes hit. The ship shudders. Men scream. Then I wake up. For 42 years, the same dream. The Americans were ghosts. We never saw them except for brief glimpses of periscopes. But they were everywhere, always watching, always waiting. We lived in terror of the silent death. Another survivor, former engineer officer Kenji Matsumoto, who was rescued after the sinking of transport Asamaru in November 1944, recalled the moment his ship was hit. We were 60 miles south of Formosa when the torpedoes struck. I was in the engine room. The impact threw me against the bulkhead. Water rushed in. The lights failed. In darkness, I felt my way to the ladder. Men were climbing over each other, crushing the weak and injured. I made it to the deck. The ship was listing heavily to port. I jumped into the water. Oil covered the surface. When I opened my eyes, oil burned them. I swam away from the ship as best I could. Behind me, I heard men still trapped aboard, screaming as the ship went down. I floated for 6 hours before being rescued. The American submarine that killed us disappeared. We never saw it. Just the sound of torpedoes, the explosion, the screaming, then silence. The strategic implications of the submarine campaign extended beyond simple tonnage figures. American submarines forced Japan to adopt convoy systems that drastically reduced shipping efficiency. Ships waiting to form convoys sat idle for days or weeks. Zigzag routes designed to avoid submarines added days to voyages. Slower convoy speeds reduced the number of trips per year each ship could make. Combined with actual sinkings, these inefficiencies reduced Japan's effective shipping capacity by approximately 60% even for ships that survived. Moreover, submarine warfare diverted Japanese resources from offensive operations to defensive convoy protection. Destroyers that could have escorted carrier task forces instead protected merchant convoys. Aircraft that could have struck American bases instead flew anti-submarine patrols. Radar systems that could have warned of American bomber raids instead searched for submarines. The psychological burden of defending against an invisible enemy that struck without warning consumed Japanese military planning throughout the last 2 years of the war. Perhaps most significantly, submarine warfare made Japanese defensive strategy impossible to execute. Operation Show, Japan's plan to defend the Philippines, required massive reinforcement of garrison forces. American submarines prevented these reinforcements from arriving. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was fought with Japanese forces in the Philippines significantly weaker than planned because submarines had sunk the transport convoys carrying reinforcements. Japanese defensive positions throughout the Pacific Islands suffered from inadequate supplies and undermanned garrisons because submarines interdicted the supply lines. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy succeeded partly because Japanese garrisons were isolated, undersupplied, and unable to receive reinforcements. American submarines created this isolation. Every bypassed Japanese garrison that withered on its island while MacArthur advanced toward Japan was a garrison that submarines had cut off from support. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities succeeded partly because Japanese fighters lacked fuel to intercept American bombers. Submarines had sunk the tankers that would have brought oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese refineries. The American submarine campaign against Japan was the most successful commerce destruction operation in naval history. German U-boats in the Atlantic sank 14 million tons of Allied shipping but failed to strangle Britain. British submarines against German commerce were hampered by Germany's land connections to European resources. Japanese submarines focused on warships rather than merchant shipping and achieved minimal impact. Only American submarines succeeded in completely destroying an enemy's merchant fleet and crippling an enemy's war economy through commerce warfare alone. The legacy of this campaign shaped post-war naval doctrine worldwide. The United States Navy, recognizing submarine effectiveness, made nuclear submarines the centerpiece of Cold War naval strategy. The Soviet Union, studying American Pacific submarine operations, built the world's largest submarine fleet. Modern naval warfare doctrine assumes that submarines will dominate commerce warfare in any future conflict. The psychological impact of invisible hunters that strike without warning and then vanish remains fundamental to submarine warfare theory. For Japan, the submarine campaign produced a national trauma that influenced post-war maritime policy. The Maritime Self-Defense Force, Japan's post-war navy, placed enormous emphasis on anti-submarine warfare. Japanese technical expertise in sonar and anti-submarine systems became world-leading. The memory of losing 8.8 million tons of shipping and over 100,000 lives to submarines created a cultural determination that such vulnerability would never exist again. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of war's end, a memorial was dedicated in Tokyo to Japanese merchant mariners who died during World War II. The memorial wall lists 60,000 names of merchant sailors killed in the war. Most died in submarine attacks. The inscription reads, **, they sailed into danger, knowing death awaited them. They served their nation faithfully until the sea claimed them. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten. **. Among the names on that wall are the thousands who died in the great convoy disasters. The 4,755 men of Tamatsu Maru sunk in minutes by USS Spadefish. The 2,665 people aboard T. Maru torpedoed by USS Rasher. The 3,437 soldiers of Myosin Maru destroyed by USS Pakuta. The 1,481 passengers and crew of Tutsuta Maru sent to the bottom by USS Tarpon. These names represent only a fraction of the dead. For every named casualty, 3 more died whose names were never recorded, lost in ships that sank so completely that casualty lists could never be compiled. The final accounting of American submarine warfare against Japan reveals numbers that stagger comprehension. 1,314 Japanese merchant ships sunk, over 5.3 million tons of merchant shipping destroyed, 97,342 Japanese soldiers killed in transport sinkings, tens of thousands of merchant sailors killed, thousands of forced laborers and prisoners of war killed. Japan's war economy strangled, strategic resources unable to reach the homeland, oil supplies exhausted, food imports ceased, industrial production collapsed. All accomplished by a force that never exceeded 288 submarines and 36,000 personnel. The men who served aboard American submarines during the Pacific War paid a terrible price for the success. 22% killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any American military branch during World War II. 52 submarines lost. 3,556 men who never returned home. These men fought an invisible war beneath the waves, unknown to the public, uncelebrated in newsreels. Their achievements classified until after the war ended. They endured depth charge attacks that lasted hours, crushing pressure at extreme depths, mechanical failures far from support, and the constant psychological stress of operating in an environment where any mistake meant death for the entire crew. But they succeeded beyond all expectations. They transformed submarine warfare from an experimental weapon into the dominant force in naval warfare. They proved that a small number of highly trained personnel using advanced technology could achieve strategic effects far beyond their numbers. They demonstrated that economic warfare systematically applied could destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war more effectively than direct military combat. They showed that intelligence, technology, and tactical innovation could overcome numerical inferiority and achieve total victory. For the Japanese merchant mariners, naval officers, and soldiers who faced American submarines during the Pacific War, the experience was one of helplessness and terror. They sailed into waters patrolled by invisible hunters. They watched torpedoes emerge from darkness and tear through steel hulls. They heard trapped men screaming as compartments flooded. They floated in oil-covered water hoping for rescue that often never came. And they continued to sail because duty demanded it, even as fear consumed them. The Japanese feared American submarines more than anything else because submarines represented a threat they could not counter, could not see, could not predict, and could not escape. Against this invisible, omnipresent threat, Japanese sailors and soldiers were helpless. They could only sail forward and hope to survive. Most did not. The Silent Death, as Japanese sailors called American submarines, claimed more Japanese lives than any weapon system in the Pacific War except aerial bombing. It destroyed Japan's capacity to sustain its empire, isolated Japanese garrisons across the Pacific, and strangled Japan's war economy. 60 years after war's end, survivors still woke screaming from nightmares of torpedoes striking their ships. American submarines did not just sink ships. They sank Japan's ability to wage war and the confidence of every Japanese sailor who watched his ship disappear beneath the waves. The fear was not of dying in battle, but of dying helplessly, trapped in a sinking hold, drowning in darkness, while an invisible enemy escaped untouched. That fear explains why Japanese sailors called American submarines the weapon they feared more than anything else in the Pacific. Why Japanese feared American submarines more than anything else. August 18, 1944. 22:10 hours, 320 feet beneath the South China Sea. Lieutenant Commander Henry Mason adjusted the periscope, watching through the darkness with radar as the massive convoy approached. 13 ships, the largest troop convoy he had seen in months. What Mason did not know was that his submarine, USS Rasher, was about to trigger the most catastrophic single night in Japanese naval transport history. A slaughter so complete that it would send shock waves through every Japanese officer commanding shipping lanes across the Pacific. Aboard the escort carrier Taio, Captain Shuichi Sujino stood on the bridge, scanning the dark horizon with growing unease. The convoy HI-71 carried 4,795 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, desperately needed reinforcements for the Philippines. Since January 1944, convoys like his had been bleeding. Ships disappeared into the depths with terrifying regularity. The Americans called them submarines. The Japanese had another name for them, the Silent Death. What began as scattered attacks in 1942 had become an organized campaign of destruction by 1944 that would ultimately sink 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. Over 5.3 million tons of shipping would vanish beneath the waves by war's end. But the true horror was not measured in tonnage. It was measured in the tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who drowned in darkness, trapped in sinking holds as American torpedoes tore through steel hulls. This is the story of how American submarines created a terror so profound that Japanese merchant sailors began refusing assignments, how convoy commanders falsified routes to avoid known submarine zones, and how the silent hunters beneath the waves destroyed not just Japan's logistics but the very psychology of an empire that depended on the sea. The nightmare had begun on December 7, 1941, but not in the way most remember. While Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, 29 American submarines of the Asiatic Fleet waited in Philippine waters. Within hours of the attack, Admiral Thomas Hart issued the order that would define the Pacific Submarine War: execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no mercy. Every Japanese merchant ship was now a target. But the American submarine force was not ready. 55 fleet submarines and 18 obsolete S-boats comprised the entire Pacific force. Worse still, they carried a weapon that did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo, pride of American naval ordnance, was fundamentally flawed. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. Its depth mechanism ran 11 feet deeper than set. Its contact exploder crumpled on impact instead of detonating. For 18 months, American submarines would fire torpedoes that simply failed to explode against Japanese hulls. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout recorded his frustration in December 1941. Asterisk fired 4 torpedoes at a sitting Japanese transport from 1,500 yards. All 4 hit with solid metallic clangs. None exploded. Watched helplessly as the ship sailed away undamaged. Asterisk. The sound of those non-explosions haunted every submariner. They called it the sound of betrayal. Japanese merchant officers in early 1942 sailed with confidence. Their military assured them that American submarines posed minimal threat. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine developed in the 1920s and early 1930s assumed submarines would be used against warships in fleet actions, not against merchant vessels. Japan had never seriously prepared for a war against commerce raiders. The Imperial Japanese Navy had allocated exactly 47 vessels for convoy escort duty when the war began. For comparison, Britain employed over 400 escorts in the Atlantic. Japanese depth charges were set to explode at 60 feet. American submarines routinely operated at 300 feet or deeper. Captain Tamakihara of destroyer Shigure later wrote, asterisk, "We treated submarine defense as an afterthought, a duty for obsolete ships and inexperienced crews. The elite destroyer force was reserved for fleet actions against American carriers and battleships. Protecting merchant ships was considered unglamorous work beneath samurai warriors. This contempt for defensive warfare would cost Japan the war." Asterisk. By mid-1943, American submarines had solved their torpedo problems through the desperate efforts of commanders who disobeyed orders and conducted their own tests. Admiral Charles Lockwood proved the Mark 14 ran deep by firing at fishing nets suspended at known depths. The torpedoes passed underneath. Submarine commanders proved the contact exploder failed by test firing against Hawaiian cliffs. The torpedo struck but did not explode until it tumbled back into deep water where pressure triggered it. Once these defects were corrected, American submarines transformed into the most lethal commerce raiders in naval history. The mathematics of destruction became overwhelming. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling 725,000 tons. Torpedo production problems limited their effectiveness. Many skippers trained in peacetime proved too cautious. But as aggressive commanders replaced timid ones, as code breaking provided convoy routes, as new construction delivered 40 submarines per year, the campaign intensified beyond Japanese capacity to respond.